Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of the Author Spotlight event, which is one of the flagship programs of the West African Transitional Justice Center. The West African Transitional Justice Center is a center that has been designed on the continent to help bridge the gap between the research and practice of transitional justice, not just along the West African corridor, but generally across Africa. And we've been able to also make interventions even beyond the continent. We are happy to have, as part of our event today, some erudite scholars, having been facilitated by Professor Tim Muriti, who edited a book volume that we're going to be discussing today. So our program today is focused on a book titled African Union and Transitional Justice, Healing the Past and Restoring Human Dignity. You all agree with me that this is something that is quite important and relevant for a world that is in need of healing. And it cannot come at a better time where a lot of African countries are in transitions. We remember, particularly in our own context in West Africa, we've had some forceful transitions through military coup d'etat, and we're hoping that there will be restoration of normalcy in troubled countries on the continent at the moment. So without further ado, it's a privilege to welcome all of our panelists. We have Professor Tim Muriti of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa. We have Ms. Munini Mutuku, who is at the National Cohesion and Integration Commission in Kenya. We have Dr. Shingirai Mteru, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Nordic African Institute in Sweden. We have Mr. Zikamai Bere, the National Director of Zimbabwe Human Rights Association, and also Mr. Patrick Ajayandi, also of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa. We are privileged to have them as contributors to this volume they will be taking us through some aspects of this very important text. So without further ado, I would love to hand over the platform to Professor Tim Muriti to help us introduce the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olayuku. Very grateful for you to be graciously hosting this very important book discussion. And we're very grateful to the West Africa Center for Transitional Justice, Dr. Philip and team, for convening this very important book discussion. And this is our small contribution to generating new knowledge in Africa by Africans. And so we commend all those who have been part of this initiative, who will be speaking shortly. And this has been achieved, I should mention, through our partnership with CEDA, as well as the government of Norway. The book is entitled The African Union and Transitional Justice, Healing the Past, Restoring Human Dignity. And it is available on our website for you to download. So feel free to go in there and get yourself a copy. And it has been compiled by 13 authors from across Africa. And I just want to acknowledge from my side also Dr. Shingi Mtero, Munini Mutuku, Tsekamai Bere, Patrick Hajiandi, who will be speaking to you later about their specific contributions. And what we find in the book, a number of chapters that contribute to conceptual issues, including the politics of transitional justice, which relates to a lot of the issues many countries are facing with at the moment, gender and culture, as well as environmental justice, which will feature in our conversation today. And it does include 3 case studies relating to national transitional justice initiatives: Central African Republic, Zimbabwe, which will feature today, Burundi, which will also feature today. And it also focuses on continental and regional transitional justice initiatives with a look at how the wider African Union system engages with the AUTJP, which will also be discussed in our meeting today, and the role of the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, as well as the Intergovernmental Authority on Reconciliation, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which also features in the book. I don't want to take the thunder away from the authors, so I will let them speak shortly and hand back to Dr. Philip to introduce them. The book concludes, I think, just to say, with some forward-looking strategies to enhance and strengthen the implementation of this African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which was adopted in February 2019, which you can also download for yourselves. And it focuses also on the role of youth actors in implementing AUTJP, capacity building and training strategies, lessons from the COVID-19 epidemic and the limitations of transitional justice initiatives, and then IJAR's Pan-African Reconciliation Network. So I do commend the book for you to read and engage with, use in your either educational or policy or training platforms going forward. And as I said again, we're very grateful to Dr. Olayuku for this kind invitation to be part of this group discussing this book today. Thank you very much, Doc, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's a pleasure to always have you as part of the members of the family. You've always been around us, and we're always grateful for your support. So without further ado, I'd love to invite Ms. Munini Mutuku to help start the conversation with our own presentation. Yeah. I got your slides, by the way, so depends on whether you want to share them or you want me to. Any is fine. If you can, that's fine. Just try from your end first.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to share them from my end. Thank you so much for having me and for the invitation to this session. And also, I want to thank those who have joined us and who are part of this discussion. So I'll be presenting on Chapter 4, which is Environmental Transitional Justice, a critique of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, but not the slides yet.
Okay, let me. Is that better?
I can't from my end yet. I don't know whether any other person could confirm.
It's not open. I can see just the presentation.
Yeah.
It's not open.
So it's your desktop that is showing, not the presentation. Have you opened it?
Okay, let me stop share. Let me try that again. So is it showing now?
Yeah, still waiting. Yeah, it's showing now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Oh, thank you so much. So in my work as a transitional justice and peace building practitioner, I have come through several articles. And one of them said, elephants return to conflict-ridden national park. And something came to mind. So when humans leave conflict areas, animals also leave. And when humans come back to their countries after conflict, and when things are settling down, actually animals also come back. And that was a mind-opening time. I came across the issue of dumping radioactive waste in conflict countries. And this was not only within the East Africa region, Somalia, it was also within the West African region, but largely within the conflict countries. Again, the oil industries in conflict countries, a scenario that has created a lot of damage within our continent. The oil spills that damage the ecosystems and the environment. Then I came across this campaign, which gave me a different perspective. And I realized, you know what? It's true. It was just a reminder that humans are not alone on the planet. But somehow we have always operated like we are alone on this planet. And so the only justice we tend to seek, even within transitional justice, was the justice for human beings, and we completely forgot the other life systems that also need justice in post-conflict scenarios. And so my chapter was born. And then I looked at the transitional justice policy, and I realized there are certain gaps. And so this chapter highlights some of the gaps that I identified within this policy, having acquired the perspective of looking at justice from an environmental perspective. There was a missing link between transitional justice and environmental justice, which is very quiet within this policy. And largely, it overlooks the post-conflict environmental justice. For instance, with the scenarios that I have just shared, what do we do with environmental restoration? How about the cleaning of the oil spills in our lands, the remediation, the rehabilitation, and the protection initiatives that are not human-focused, but are focused on the other life systems that also help us sustain our own lives? The argument of this paper has been that there's enough evidence of environmental damage and crimes caused by war and violent conflicts. And so environment is a silent victim. Environment is also weaponized. For instance, when the waters are poisoned and the soils are poisoned, targeting or killing populations. This paper further argues that there's a need to provoke thoughts and elicit a discussion on how can we address environment within transitional justice. And within these pillars, truth, memorialization, justice, reparations, how do we address the issue of environment? Can we create a place for non-human life systems in this justice space? The paper further argues that actually asks, how can we have more actors engage in transitional justice? The ecologists, the environmental managers, especially within this space of environmental justice. The paper picks up certain cases, trying to make a case that if transitional justice was to engage within the environment and ecosystem space, it would not be new. There are certain cases, recommendations that have been given by our own human rights institutions within the continent that actually would support these efforts. The paper talks about Sudan, Liberia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Sudan, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights gave a communication, and this was about the poisoning of water sources, and it called for rehabilitation, recognizing that the social and the environmental justice components have a linkage. In Liberia, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it had a mandate. And one of the mandates was to investigate the economic crimes, which include exploitation of natural and public resources. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, it was a communication on the role of Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda in the illegal exploitation of natural resources in Congo. And the commission gave a communication asking for the reparations for damage and acts of looting. So for transitional justice, this would not be a strange phenomenon for it to engage in. That's what the paper argues. And the paper gives some proposals and recommendations. It says, how about we start looking at transitional justice from an environmental perspective, or greening transitional justice, if you like. To recognize that the environmental change and social justice, there is a link. How about formulation of strategies for implementation of the policy that should enhance justice, one, for the environment as a victim, and two, for human victims of environmental crimes and abuses or damage? The paper further proposes and recommends restorative justice. But in this case, we're talking about ecological restorative justice, ecological restoration, the repair and the restoration of ecosystems and the environment. It further recommends or proposes environmental justice at least should look at two aspects: the distributive environmental justice element that looks at fairness and equity of the goods and also the burdens of the ecosystems and the environment, but also procedural environmental justice, where we talk about people participation. In conclusion, the paper says that the environment is a victim and should be considered as such. It talks about victim statements that are focused on the environmental ecosystems, hearings before truth commissions on environmental injustices, or even the creation of green tribunals. It further talks about dispute resolution platforms that focus on natural resources and brings the question of transboundary resources that are regional and transnational, which would be a new dynamic to consider, especially when natural resources are transnational and regional, and thus transitional justice will have to go beyond the national borders. And the paper ends there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Monini Mutuku. Miss using MS, not just as a mark of respect, not anything on status. Yeah. So
You're
we're
right.
grateful. Yeah. We're grateful for helping us to call attention to something that's very important that's often been neglected in the space, which is the environment that we take for granted on a daily basis. All of us are guilty, one way or the other, of not being conscious enough of our environment. Most of us, let me say, maybe not all, you know. So thank you very much. And as you were speaking, my thoughts just went to how to even hold people accountable, since we have a lot of external actors who are participating in terms of the violation of the environment. And the discussions can always go on during the session. So now we'll go to our next panelist, Mr. Patrick Ajayande, to help take us through his own contribution to the volume. Mr. Patrick, are you there?
Okay. Yes, I'm there. I don't know if you allow me not to use the video because the internet is not very good. So you hear my voice.
Yeah, that's
Is that
fine.
okay?
That's fine. Yeah, that's perfect.
All right.
We've seen your face briefly. That's fine for us. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I am going to discuss chapter 7 of this book, where I discuss Burundi and the memorization of past violations with some ideas on insights from the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. The first point in this chapter is my insistence actually on the need to create a space for memorization as a much needed aspect of transitional justice mechanism. Why? Because in the past, this process has been somehow neglected. But thanks to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, it is being now put at the forefront so that people who are engaged in transitional justice processes can also be mindful of the need to include memorization in one of the key elements of this process. Secondly, the chapter insists on the traumatic history of Burundi, which makes the case study particular for this chapter, where I discuss the traumatic history of Burundi, a country that has been affected by cycle of violence actually since the inception of independence in 1962. Actually, we can even say since 1961, before independence, just slightly before independence, because that's when the first prime minister was assassinated in line with what was happening in DRC with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and all these stalwart for independence who have been assassinated, leaving a political vacuum which has been crucial in creating the ensuing chaos. In the case of Burundi, actually, this has been very detrimental because the death of Louis Rwagasore, who was the prime minister, created strife within his own political party, starting with the aspect of dynasties, which were in power in Burundi, then going back to down to the ethnic strife. And from that time, there have been ongoing violence characterized by ethnicity between the Hutus and the Tutsi. So one of the key aspects of this history of Burundi is the fact that whenever we are discussing about the past, about what happened, there is an ongoing contradictions. The Tutsi depict themselves as victims on one side, and on the other side, the Hutu also will depict themselves as victims. So, and no one is yet to accept the suffering of the other side. And this is where the situation becomes very complicated. And this is some the aspect I discuss as an important problem that the Truth and Reconciliation in Burundi is facing, because there is a part of the population which accept the work the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is doing, and there is a part of the population which does not accept this work. And it's very challenging. So this is very important to know that when you are dealing with the memorization and you are in a country where the memory is antagonistic, when people do not see the history in the same way, it is always important to be able to listen to all voices and to create a space for all those voices to be heard, so that no one feels that is left behind. The other aspect of the chapter I insist on is the challenges, the challenge that the memorization process itself in Burundi is faced with. The first one is, of course, the very contradiction I just mentioned, which do not allow people to have a common ground where they can be able to hear the stories from the other side and be somehow compassionate. And this is, in my view, the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Burundi has to do to ensure that everyone's story is on the table, and his pain is acknowledged. His or her pain is acknowledged, because this is what most people want. And the second challenges that I've mentioned is that in Burundi, we still have a number of people who committed crimes, but who are still in powerful positions. This is a very big challenges for the country, because these people who committed crimes they tend to control the narrative. They also, in certain way, try to undermine the process itself of memorization so that they can protect themselves for an eventual indictment or any other form of accusation. So that's why they have been working tirelessly to make sure that even the work of the Truth and Reconciliation itself does not move forward. So there are, of course, other challenges, but these, I think, are the main challenges I have been observing, and I highlighted them so that if in other countries they intend to put in place uh, transitional justice mechanism, they be mindful of these challenges, and if there is any way they can avoid them, so that they work on this issue and try to avoid it. Um, and I also mentioned some of the initiatives that the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation has been involved in Burundi in particular. So, which in summary have been around creating or opening up a space for what I call the silenced voices to be uh, to to be able to express themselves. One of the particular aspects of the history of Burundi is that in for the particular case of what is called as a genocide, which took place in 1972, the victims were silenced. No one was allowed to cry. No one was allowed to mourn. And many people do not even, till today, they do not know where their loved ones went. So there are some people who think their parents or their brothers or sisters are still alive or just went missing while they are already dead. So, and this is the trauma they carry out. But for almost 30 years, they have been silenced. They were not allowed to speak out. And the contribution of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation has been to be able to create a space for these people to be able to express themselves. How did we do it? We did it in two ways. The first one was to create an intergenerational dialogue where young people and older generation come together and discuss about the past. The second way has been uh, to has been through a documentary film where we interview people who are witnesses or their widows or orphans from the 1972 genocide, so that they can express themselves and share their pain. Because everyone who shares his pain, after sharing what he went through, after sharing his experience, he says or she said that it's like a part of healing process which is taking place. So that's what we have been doing. And a third way has been also to collect testimonies that we are putting in a book. So those are some of the initiatives the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation is involved in Burundi. And I believe it's a serious contribution, although it is still small, but it's a serious contribution toward the healing process. So in conclusion, I insist on the need for the political leadership to create conditions which allow all people to be acknowledged, their pain to be acknowledged, and a process which is as inclusive as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ajayandi, for your very insightful contribution and for your work in putting um, out this chapter. I think memorization is an integral part of transitional justice, and we commend the IJR for the very important work that they are doing, not just in Burundi, but in other parts of the continent. Memorization, like you mentioned, has to touch on how we remember, some of these events. And I love the fact that you linked it to victimhood, and identity. When you spoke about the Tutsis and the Hutus, these are very important aspects to say when we create memory initiatives. How do we interpret them? Because it's not just for this generation, but how do people who come after us process what has happened in the past? What kind of narratives are we going to leave to them in order to engender peace, within such within their own context here? Without dwelling too much on that, I would like to invite Dr. Untero to lead us through our own chapter.
Thank you so much, Philip. I'm just going to speak to my chapter, but I think I need to share. Is it possible? There we go.
Yeah, it's working now.
Is it working?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I need to just move this tab a little bit so I can get to the slideshow section. Okay. So I'm speaking to chapter 8. My name is Shingirai Mutero, and my section covers the African Union system and engaging the wider African Union system for the purposes of transitional justice and implementing the AUTJP. Maybe I can begin again by thanking Prof. Murithi for the leadership in this project. I think that one of the things that the book highlights in the introduction is the need to create African knowledge based on African realities, and particularly engaging scholars, scholarship, and experiences from the African continent and the global South. So I am very happy and privileged to have been part of this project, and I hope that it does the type of work that we envision it to do to influence the ways that universities, institutions, CSOs, diplomats do their work when it comes to transitional justice, but also speak to the broader subject of transitional justice in the rest of the world and in the global South. So my chapter is called African Union Systems and the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And I'll begin by just talking to, I think, the main sections. So I speak on constraints to implementing the AUTJP, and then I speak to opportunities towards implementing the AUTJP. One of the things that the chapter does at the beginning is use this diagram that looks at the way that I thought through engaging the wider AU system. And so what I propose is engaging the wider AU system to implement the AUTJP, and I outline specific actors or categories of the AU system. Specifically, I look at AU member states, and then the next thing that I look at is the African Union organs, and I put or pay particular attention to specific organs that deal with peace and security, justice and reconciliation. Those are outlined in this little diagram here. And then I also speak to the use and the mobilization of specific AU protocols and policies, because there are many normative contributions within protocols and policies that the AU has produced that are not only groundbreaking for the continent, but for the world at large. And so I think it's important that we engage these protocols and policies for the implementation of the AUTJP, or the strengthening the implementation of the AUTJP. And the last thing that I speak about in the chapter with regards to the AU system is engaging civil society and creating partnerships between the African Union member states, its organs, and civil society actors on the continent. And so what this diagram basically proposes is using this multi-sectoral, multi-level engagement process with the end goal of better implementing the African Union Transitional Justice Policy within particular African states, and then of course as well within our regions. So what I'm going to do is just speak to the next section of the paper or the chapter, which deals with constraints and challenges. I thought it was good to deal with constraints and challenges because often we deal with them last and then we end on a negative note. And I think because of the potential of the AUTJP, it'll be good to end on a positive note, which would be to engage the opportunities. So I started off with engaging the challenges and the constraints. The first thing that I noted was with regards to funding and resource mobilization. In this section, I basically note that the African Union is heavily reliant on external partners for funding. This has traditionally been so and continues to be both at the level of the African Union, some of our regional economic communities, and then within our states as well. And because of this, it means that programs that deal with the implementation of policies continues to face significant challenges when it comes to resource mobilization. So I note that as the first key challenge that the African Union system has when it comes to transitional justice. The next challenge, which I think is more significant and definitely more challenging and complex, is the nature of the African nation state. I make the point here that the nature of African states, and that this is not just the nature of African states, but of nation states across the globe, is that often when they are put in a position where they must select between their own survival, concerns of sovereignty, economic development, economic benefits, and then on the other side, consider issues having to do with justice and accountability, they often choose the former. And because of that, there has been a selective uptake and support of initiatives aimed at increasing accountability and justice in the areas of governance within the AU. And I think that this is very evident when we look, for instance, at the selective uptake of African states and the African peer review mechanism. The fact that we don't have any substantive policy or protocol that enforces or forces states to subject themselves to the APRM is an issue, and the fact that they have to volunteer is also an issue. And the states that have volunteered, I use the example of Equatorial Guinea in this regard, don't have, there is no enforcement measures to ensure that they take up the recommendations of the APRM. And so we find ourselves in a position where even though the African Union itself does provide avenues through its organs to increase the uptake of, or to increase accountability and the plurality of democracy within the country, its member states, the countries ultimately have to volunteer themselves for those processes. And oftentimes when it comes down to it, they will pick what is politically expedient and what ensures their survival over matters that relate to accountability and justice. And I make the point here that if we look at what the AUTJP prescribes within the context of a TJ crisis, if there is a civil war or civil unrest, the AUTJP advises the creation of transitional justice commissions for truth-telling and reconciliation, accountability, and judicial processes. And we can see, because of the nature of the African state, African states often do not initiate the process to create transitional justice commissions. And when they do, there is, the record has been disappointing with the ultimate outcome of these commissions. And so I make the point in this section that if we look, for instance, at the Marikana Commission in South Africa, the Motlanthe Commission in Zimbabwe, the Waki Commission in Kenya, when African states do choose to create commissions for truth and reconciliation, the ultimate outcome is not always accountability and justice. And I think even now, if we think about the events of this year, the events of the last 2 months, if we look at Kenya and the protests that took place, not just in Nairobi, but across the country, we will wait with bated breath to find out if Ruto and his parliament will create a commission of inquiry for investigation, and whether or not the outcome of that inquiry or investigation will actually hold people accountable, because we know how complicit the state was in the deaths and the injuries that took place during those protests. And so this is one of the key challenges that I note. I think this challenge is linked to the next one, where I make the point that African Union organs for transitional justice are state-led and state-capacitated. And because of this and the complicity of states in the processes that lead to the requirement of us engaging the AUTJP, many times the pursuit of accountability is mutually exclusive with state sovereignty. And I think I've spoken to this point in the previous point, so I won't go into a lot of depth with it. But the reality is that our AU organs for peace and security, for governance, for advisory, are state capacitated, and because of that reality, there's always this tug of war between state sovereignty, accountability, and justice. And then the last point that I make in this section is with regards to AU protocols and policies. And I just note here that there are some contradictions that exist between and within the policies and protocols that the AU has created when it comes to issues of accountability and justice. I make an example here about the African Court on Human and People's Rights and the ability of states to opt in and opt out of accepting the court's jurisdiction, and then also the ability of states to opt in and opt out of allowing individuals and organizations to bring cases before the court. And because of this contradiction, it means that the court is sort of hamstrung when it comes to adjudicating cases that have to deal with human rights violations and civil unrest. I also make the note here around the proposed African Court of Justice and Human Rights and Article 46A bis that gives state leaders or senior leaders immunity from prosecution if they commit or if they do things during their official duties that violate international criminal law. And so already, even though this the Malabo Protocol has not come into force, there already exists a contradiction within it that incapacitates it from holding people accountable in the face of international crimes like genocide and war crimes. And so I make the point in this section that because of these contradictions, it creates a negative vacuum within the justice architecture of the continent, as current and future perpetrators of international crimes are given the space to avoid prosecution and accountability. So these contradictions are a key challenge that I note when it comes to implementing the AUTJP through the existing African Union system. What I'm going to do next is to just go over the opportunities. That's what the next section of the paper, of the chapter, deals with. And in this section, if you'll allow me to just go back to this last, the diagram, I basically make points with regards to the AU member states, the AU organs, the AU protocols and policies, and the proposal for stronger partnerships between the AU system and civil society actors and civil society organizations on the continent. And so basically what I argue in this section, or what I propose, are different methods through which the existing African Union system can be used to implement or to mobilize the AU-TJP in effective ways. And so the first point that I make in this section with regards to the AU policies and protocols, I argue here that the AU policies and protocols that already exist present or provide established normative frameworks as benchmarks and guidelines and blueprints for transitional justice on the continent. And if these can be successfully employed and implemented through the AU-TJP, they can give states and regions better guidance of how to initiate and implement their own transitional justice processes. I make the point here that there are specific AU protocols with regards to, for instance, the Maputo Protocol, which are excellent when it comes to issues relating to gender and women's access to political participation, etc. In the aftermath of civil unrest, that would be very useful for creating a transitional justice process or implementing transitional justice processes. The next point that I make here is with regards to AU organs, and I basically make the point that key AU organs and institutions have the capacity to aid in the implementation and objectives of the AU-TJP. I outline here that members of the African governance architecture are especially well positioned to support transitional justice efforts, as they have a collective mandate to spearhead continental efforts towards good governance and democracy. And so within the AGA, I basically make the argument that they have the most capacity to support national and regional transitional justice efforts. And in this regard, the Peace and Security Commission, the AUC, the APRM, the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, and NEPAD have well-established institutional resources, networks, and track records of success that would be very useful to states that require assistance in implementing transitional justice processes. I make the point as well here that these organs also have the capacity to offer strong technical and diplomatic support to regional economic communities and individual states that require assistance in their transitional justice processes or efforts. And so the AU organs that already exist are very well suited and primed to serve the continent, whether it's at a regional level or individual state level, for successful TJ processes. I spoke in the last section about this funding issues, and so I make the point here when it comes to resource mobilization that the AU can mobilize resources and funding through the AU system through strategic implementation of the different organs that they have. I make the point that, for instance, the African Commission could consider the introduction of financial contributions for transitional justice from its member states as well. The African Free Trade area that has been introduced could be used to mobilize funds for transitional justice processes. And then the last point that I make in this section has to do with strategic partnerships between AU member states, the AU itself, and African CSOs. And I just basically make the point here that CSOs have played a significant role in drafting transitional justice policies, pushing governments to adopt these policies, holding governments accountable, and assisting citizens and victims to access justice in the aftermath of conflicts. And they are best positioned as far as if we're looking for strategic partners for collaboration, they are best positioned to assist the African Union and individual states in implementing transitional justice programs. I make examples of particular CSOs like the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, PALU, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, who have been instrumental in creating strong policies and protocols for the for the AU to use. I also make the point about the extensive networks that CSOs often have at grassroots levels and communities that give them more access than other actors, particularly international actors, when it comes to implementing transitional justice programs. I can see that I need to end. I conclude in this section by giving concluding remarks. And I think basically what I conclude by is giving an overview of the chapter and reiterating the argument that employing a multi-sectoral, multi-level and multi-actor approach to transitional justice through engaging the AU system is essential if we want to implement the AU TJP in a positive way. And I make the point here, lastly, that the successful implementation of the objectives of the AU TJP can't be left to governments of member states alone. It requires strategic and effective collaborations between the African Union member states, its organs, African CSOs, I would add here African scholars, as African citizens, and the affected communities. And my hope is that this work engages or rather encourages the use of the existing AU system for the better implementation of the transitional justice policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ontero, for your very important contribution to the volume. I think it's important to interrogate the ecosystem of the implementation of transitional justice mechanisms across different countries. And it's nice to see that you focus not just on the actors, but also the instruments that they use, And as you were talking, what came to my mind specifically was about resource mobilization, which may be the reason why interventions are often initiated from the outside. How do we look inwards to start making use of the resources that we have, on the continent? We can't always rely on outsiders to carry our burden for us. Mainly because these guys have time constraints, even for their own reporting that we have to deal with, and they are not really very affected by the outcomes of some of these interventions. Thank you very much, Dr. Ontero. We'll open the floor up for the question and answer session after the next presentation to be given by Mr. Bere. If he's here, the platform is just been handed over to you. Is it okay? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, first just to begin by acknowledging and thanking Professor Tim Muriti for coordinating these efforts that led to this publication. My background is mainly from, I'm a practitioner from the practice of transitional justice. So my contribution to this book looks mainly on what we do on the ground in terms of influencing and implementing transitional justice. So I work with, I'm based in Zimbabwe, and I work with a grassroots movement called Zimbabwe Human Rights Association, which is a movement of more than 250,000 ordinary people coming together to fight for human rights. And my chapter contributions in this book, there are two. One is the chapter that you find on page 85, which focuses on, that's page 85, yes, which focuses on, it's a case study on Zimbabwe and the role of civil society in leveraging the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. The second chapter, you find that on page 145, which looks at the role of youth actors in advancing transitional justice. So I will be brief. I will tackle both chapters in the interest of time and give the brief background. So both chapters, and I did give my background as the contributor here, as a movement builder, as part of the activist movement, as part of the communities that are clamoring for transitional justice. So when you look at both chapters, the contribution to this book is mainly about, the role of ordinary people, the people power in transitional justice policy, or the bottom-up approach to transitional justice, which is why in one chapter I speak about non-state actors and how they can contribute to transitional justice. And then in the other chapter, I speak particularly about young people and locating them within the transitional justice ecosystem. So I will reflect a little bit on the role of civil society actors. So I begin with a reflection on the 9 principles of the AUTJP, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy Framework, and try to say, where do non-state actors fit in within the African Union thinking of transitional justice? So first, I think the AUTJP locates itself as a Pan-African approach to transitional justice, bringing in the African values of Ubuntu, balancing retributive justice and restorative justice. So that's an important claim that the policy makes. Then within the 9 values, there is within the 9 principles, there is the principle of national and local ownership. It's important to understand that national does not mean state ownership. It means it goes beyond the government that is in power. And when we talk about, so it's more inclusive. We're not looking at the state, we are looking at the nation. And then local ownership, we're now looking at the grassroots. So that principle itself, when we go deeper into it, it brings us into convergence between a national process that is much larger than one community or political group, but also local ownership, which speaks about the grassroots communities that usually are at the receiving end of injustices. The other principle that comes in there in the AUTJP is inclusivity, equity, and non-discrimination. So the moment you speak about inclusivity, it means we are going beyond the ruling elite. The other principle there is African shared values. So I already spoke about the Ubuntu, the shared values of Ubuntu, believing that we are together in building a better community. Then there is, of course, cooperation and coherence. All these, when I looked at them in my reflection, I was convinced that there is space for non-state actors. Then there is another principle there which speaks about national leadership. So the policy acknowledges that transitional justice is an obligation of national leadership. That has got a number of meanings. I reflect on 2 of them. One being that the government in power is a primary duty bearer. Now, that assumes that the government in power understands the principle of the sovereignty of the people, which is in many of our constitutions. And when we speak about the sovereignty of the people, it means whatever government is in power is there in service to the community. So it should not interpret that principle to overthrow the people from the process and say, we are the state and we must do it. Then also understanding national leadership, not to mean state leadership, meaning to say we are looking at the nation, understanding that this transitional justice business, Nelson Mandela had serious business in it when he launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela told us that leadership is not positional, it's behavioral. So when we are talking about national leadership for transitional justice, again, it places outside the monopoly of the state and understanding that non-state actors have got a role to play in advancing transitional justice. I then also, reflect in that chapter, the concept of transitional justice being future oriented. And the quotation that comes out there is the quotation from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who pointed out that transitional justice must have the ambition of assisting the transformation of oppressed societies into free ones by addressing the injustices of the past through measures that will procure an equitable future. So transitional justice has to be future-oriented, and it cannot be future-oriented if it excludes non-state actors. I also reflect on transitional justice as a liberation agenda that seeks to cure the past without duplicating the same atrocities that it seeks to redeem. I see this as a new liberation agenda in the sense that the violence, I know it's controversial, but the violence that led to the liberation of Africa, in many spaces, it created equally violent communities, equally violent government systems, just as the systems it sought to replace. You must see Harare today. Zimbabwe is going to host the SADC summit. And the state has unleashed the military mighty of Zimbabwe on its citizens. You go into the high density places, you will see the full power of a violent state. And yet this is a liberated country, bearing testimony to the fact that perhaps the tools that we used for our liberation as Africans have been worse than the disease that we sought to cure. So transitional justice gives us opportunity to rethink this liberation agenda. How do we free communities from violence without violence? So I then reflect on the work that we did here in Zimbabwe. And a key contribution in that chapter is the fact that how do we handle transitional justice in communities or in societies where the state is unwilling to provide leadership? And then we then map out what I think is an approach that brings together civil society. So in that chapter, you will find 5 steps that I put out. One is the conceptualization, which I call the reawakening, wherein communities have to become alert to the transitional justice needs of the community. They have to become alert to the woundedness of the communities in which they are. Once they become alert, many times through a leadership of civic actors, we then have to establish a coordination framework, because we don't be shooting in the dark. So I share the experience of Zimbabwe in establishing the coordination framework, which was done through the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. And once we had the coordination framework that went to the communities to conscientize the communities about transitional justice, the next thing that we then put in place was the actual transitional justice framework that found itself in the Constitution, Section 252, which established the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. The success of that commission is subject to another debate. But once we had a legal framework that says we are ready to talk transitional justice at an official level, we then formalized the coordination framework into a movement. So movement building is an important part of this. So we built the National Transitional Justice Working Group, which became more like the coordinating body towards developing a national transitional justice strategy. And I'm happy to say the National Transitional Justice Working Group had some great input into the AUTJP. And then from there, once we have a strategy in place, we push for its implementation. So that's the civil society approach to leading transitional justice that I share in this chapter. Noticing time, I'll just give a highlight on the chapter on youths to say this chapter reflects on the role that young people have to play in transitional justice. It's not new. The youth movement is not new. As Africans, we must appreciate that the liberation of Africa only came because young people decided to stand up. And they cannot be ignored today. That's why what we are seeing in Kenya, what we're seeing in Nigeria, what we're seeing in many places, it's young people playing a legitimate role of liberating their communities one way or the other. So we then make a charge. And in that chapter, I make several recommendations on how we must, as societies, harness the power of young people. That which Nelson Mandela said, when aroused, has got the power to bring down the towers of oppression. And transitional justice is about bringing down the towers of oppression. It doesn't matter it's white, as it was during the liberation, or it's black, as it is in many repressive communities today. So I close my reflection on this with a quotation that you will find in one of those chapters, that the AUTJP presents an opportunity for Africa to begin an honest conversation about its past. It allows Africans to knit together experiences from various jurisdictions for progressive transitional justice agenda that enhances the potential for justice, peace, and reconciliation. And I think it's an important opportunity for the African Union to provide leadership and set a new narrative that the leadership of Africa is not willing to ignore the injustices that are happening, but it is willing to try new approaches. And finally, that transitional justice is very African. And I think we have an opportunity to play that Pan-African role, whether as civil society, whether as national leaders, whether as movements and grassroots communities. We have an opportunity to play that leadership role, finding new strategies for the new liberation agenda without duplicating the atrocities that we seek to remedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abe, for your very wonderful contributions. 2 chapters to the volume it's quite very significant. And if I could link both of your chapters together from my own perspective, I would look at the model of activism today and the lack of what maybe Marxists may call scientific socialism, which is the consciousness, that you've advocated for in terms of the organizing and the structures, the 5 structures or the 5 steps that you proposed, in your first chapter, which between spontaneity and organizing, which is something that is very core in order to make some of these efforts sustainable. And so I would love to thank all of our panelists for their very wonderful contribution. And at this point, I would love to open the floor up for discussions. So if you have any questions, you can kindly signify by raising up your hand so that will allow you to ask the questions, or you can simply type them, in the chat box. Also, you can direct your questions to any of the panelists, or you may also wish to just throw it open so that any of them can attend to it. I don't know whether there are any comments. I made some comments earlier. Perhaps if you, since there's nobody signifying first, maybe I'll just go first. So I could start from the first panelist, Monini. She gave us a very interesting aspect of transitional justice that is not often considered, which is about the conservation, of the environment. And I'm looking at the challenges that we're having in terms of growth and development, which is always based on industrialization today. And we're advocating for, local initiatives. Of course, people are already talking about e-waste because of the technological aspects of development and how to manage some of these challenges. What would you propose as something that is sustainable in creating a balance between both of these? I know there has been efforts about energy transition, which the African continent seems to be a bit farther from than other places at this time. We know we're embracing it, use of solar energy and stuff like that. But how do we build prosperity, in a sustainable way? I know this could be a generic question, but we're also looking at transitioning communities who have to be rebuilt, after some destructions that may have taken place, during crisis situation. So how do we balance the building of prosperity with the considerations for the environment, in terms of development? I don't know if that makes sense. Then to Patrick, I would love to ask, in terms of memorialization, I think the interpretation of some of these initiatives are also very important. So how do we go about, what mechanisms can we ensure to leave a lasting legacy or impact of some of these initiatives? And I take a cue from some kinds of criticism against some monuments, the if I could call it anti-Gandhi monument in Ghana, the Roads Must Fall campaign in South Africa, and other parts, where they have challenged some previous memory initiatives, maybe not directly linked to transitional justice. But how do we ensure that the interpretation of some of these initiatives are retained, across generations, in a sustainable way? And to Dr. Ontero, of course, I'm still very interested in how we harness our local and indigenous philanthropy in driving and pushing forward, our own efforts, so that you can make them more enduring and lasting, because people who feel part of the process or who are affected by the process would see will have more commitment to it. And I make an example of Dangote, for instance, who has joined a sort of activism because of the challenges his refinery has been, operational challenges of his refinery, at the moment. And finally, to Dr. Bere, is also about how to remove this seeming contradiction between, some efforts that appear spontaneous when we want to talk about youth-led interventions. How do we make them sustainable? Because it appears that when some of these efforts are being led by youth, they seem to just fade off with time, and we have to go back again. How do we try to create this structural need that you created, your 5 steps, and integrate them into youth-led efforts, on the continent at the moment? So I don't know if Max, if you can hold on a bit, let them attend to this, then I'll just invite you. Thank you very much. Yeah, but I'll call you next.
Thank you very much for those questions. Allow me to also thank my fellow panelists for their contribution and for the discussion. You've said it well about creating a balance between development and environmental protection. It's actually a balance. But we need to realize that we need to undertake structural reparations or structural repairs. We have a system that is very driven by extraction of natural resources, and largely extraction of natural resources from the global south. And much of this extraction is driven by multinational companies that are much driven by profit. And that often negates the aspect of care and concern, not only to the communities that live within these environments, and also the cares and concerns of the communities and their livelihoods, but also the ecosystems themselves. So we need to rethink this structure. And unfortunately, the green movement or the transition movement is also very driven by trying to sustain the same lifestyle that we are saying needs to review. Consumption, capitalism. So we are changing the source of energy to sustain same level of lifestyle in terms of consumption and capitalism. And the question is this going to sustain? So there are critical questions that need to be discussed. There are critical discussions that we need to discuss or to have, especially as a continent that is being fronted as having critical minerals for this transition. We need to ask ourselves as well, critical for who and critical for what? Is it critical for ourselves and what we can do? Or are we lagging behind within this transition because others have to move forward while we are left behind? And it's also a question of how do we bring in our indigenous science and modern science into play when we talk about development and the nexus with conservation or restoration and environmental concerns and care. Oftentimes, the indigenous science is seen to be not important or backward, while actually the coming together of these two, the modern or the so-called the technology that we're having, and that we have had that have ecosystems for so long, could be a plus into the crisis that we are facing and into addressing it. So I would say it's a balance that needs discussion. It's a balance that needs critical and firm decisions that need to be made, because it will not go down without a fight. Lifestyles will not be let go without a fight. There are systems that will not let go of certain benefits that they incur from this system. They will not let go easily. So it's something that we need to continue discussing and continue to identifying strategies to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think next.
Yes, please.
All right. So let me start by saying that when you visit places like the memorial for the Holocaust in Berlin, or when you visit the genocide memorial in Kigali, there is always this deep impression which these places leave on you, and you really keep reflecting on what you saw, on the stories you heard about the experience all these people went through. And I think this is something which is very important as a lesson that such places teach, even when they themselves they don't speak, but when you see what has happened, it's always a deep lesson that you learn. So that's why when you ask this question, what kind of lesson or how do people, let's say the younger generation, can continue to interpret all these issues related to memorization? What can we do? Because I think that's the most important. What can we do to leave a legacy, a lasting legacy for the young people to understand what happened, and particularly to ensure that what happened will not happen again. So this is the often times what we say, never again. We see this word written everywhere, but we want really to make sure it's internalized, that people understand the importance of creating conditions for atrocities not to be repeated. That's why I think the first thing we should be focused on will be to not only create the space for like dialogue or exchange where people discuss about this, but also to institutionalize those spaces. What do I mean? It's the need to create, first of all, like a museum, like memory centers where people can go and be able to share these stories. This, I think, in my view, is very important to ensure that there is an institution where people can go and be able to learn. This, most of the time, it is open for everyone. Adults and young people, but there is also a need to make sure that some of the aspects of memory are included into the curricula within the education system, so that our young generation is able to learn from the past and be able to be prepared to create conditions so that they avoid the repetition of the past. So I think those are really some of the things which are very important and which we should be focused on. And in any situation where we are able to advocate, we should be insisting on the need to allow people to learn, to allow people to speak out, to allow the older generation to be able to exchange with the younger one, so that in this way, people are continuously learning about the past with insistence on the need to avoid the violence which occurred in the past. Yeah, I think that will be all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
You gave me a difficult question around harnessing resources, but particularly around how we can harness local or indigenous philanthropy towards transitional justice. Because I think you've made an important point that ownership is very important when we contribute to something, either through our own funds, our own resources, our own time, our through our own processes. We have a sense of ownership, and then we also have a sense of responsibility to seeing them through and ensuring that they achieve that which we established them for. And so I think that what I speak to in the chapter are the different AU organs or bodies that have been traditionally used to mobilize resources. And your point around Dangote is important because he has experienced a significant amount of pushback with regards to trying to create his refineries. And we can see on what is it, Twitter, X, whatever, the narratives that are being created around him trying to create a monopoly, an African monopoly for refinery. And so the point that I wanted to make here in response to your question is that I think that African philanthropy for African development exists. The blueprint is there. The activities are there. If we look at funding for health, for education, for shelter, for water access, if we look at the COVID-19, I believe I recall seeing the African billionaires or millionaires coming together to try and mobilize resources to ensure that Africans got access to COVID vaccines on time, putting together their money, etc. The problem exists when that philanthropy is going to be used, or those resources are going to be used to destabilize the political elite and the established political status quo. I think that's where the issue exists. So I don't think that if we are frank about it, that there is no money, that Africans are unwilling to contribute towards or to put their resources towards issues regarding accountability and reconciliation. The issue is that what's the word? The prerequisite is the political space and the political will of the state to allow that funding to go to that purpose. And oftentimes, if that money is going to do is, for instance, set up a special tribunal that is going to destabilize or hold people within the political elite accountable for their crimes, then suddenly we don't have the resources for those things at the national level. And so oftentimes then the buck is then given to SADC or to the African Union to initiate those processes, because there's an assumption that they will have more political will and buy-in from other states to try and not force, but to facilitate those processes to go forward. So I think if we think about resources in this area, there's a tug of war that takes place, and political will in and of itself is a resource. And that, to me, that is the resource that is missing. Or that's the resource that is in short supply when it comes to facilitating transitional justice processes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Zikama is still there? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. You ask a very important question. How do we balance spontaneity and sustainability? And we find that question in one of the 9 principles of the AUTJP, which says capacity building for sustainability. And I think that answers it. So when I look at that, I break it down into 5 key things that can allow us, 1, to define and create space for the positive participation of young people beyond spontaneity, which means sustainability. First is preparedness. When I talk about preparedness, I refer to that wisdom which says the best way to predict the future is to create it. So we need to always be in the anticipatory mode of a future that we are trying to create and begin preparing young people for that future. One of the challenges we are having with liberation movements in government is that they didn't prepare themselves to govern. They focused on preparing to fight. And today they are fighting the people because there was no investment in preparedness. As a result, the same tools and mindset that was designed for a liberation war is now proving to be toxic in peacetime Africa. So preparedness is the first thing. The second thing is being rooted in communities. So we have a number of social movements that emerge at different spaces, and I have spoken a lot around, the elite capture of civil society, wherein we become over-professionalized and we end up disconnecting from the communities that we serve. And as young people, as drivers of social change, they need to continue being rooted in the communities that they serve. When that happens, it takes us to the third point, building youth leadership. What that means for me, there is activism, mere activism as young people, but then there is leadership. So we need to be able to develop young activists to deepen their activism into real leadership. And that takes a number of things. One of those is knowledge investment. Understanding that activism is no longer just about lifting placards. It's no longer just about having the loudest voice, but it's understanding the sophistry of repression. It's understanding the interconnectedness of Africans wherever they are. It's understanding the historical significance of the African struggle and understanding and deepening our knowledge tools so that we are able to confront systems of repression, not only to replace them, but to transform society. So that calls for knowledge investment that allows us to deepen our activism. And finally, once we understand these 5 things, preparedness, being rooted in communities, we understand that the spontaneity, what we call spontaneity, is just a tool. Once communities are rooted, we understand every young person who is standing up for fees must fall. They are rooted in their community. They've got a story to tell, and they've got a role to lead in that community. So those 5 things: preparedness, rootedness in communities, building youth leadership, because everything, as John Maxwell says, rises and falls on leadership. Then knowledge investment. It's beyond just lifting placards and deepening activism. It's not just activism. It's actually civic leadership.
Thank you very much. Max, we'll come to you shortly. I just want to read the question in the chat and push it to Professor Muriti. We've not heard from him for a while. So the question is how we can use AUTJP to champion reparations of socioeconomic and cultural rights. Max. Okay, let me allow you on mute.
My question is pretty straightforward. I wanted to know how AU can raise funds because according to the speaker, sorry, Mtero, I don't know if I got it correct. Yeah, he mentioned that as one of the challenges, and I think it has been there for a very long time. So how do we raise such funds, to pursue such independent policy, in transitioning Africa to where we want to be?
Okay, that's fine. I think it's frozen. Then Lawal, can you unmute? So I'll just take it.
Yes. Yeah. Hi everyone. It's quite an engaging session, though I played catch up because I ran late. Apologies to everyone on that. Yeah. I think I joined when the conversation about resource mobilization and how much of the outbound the resource mobilization has been. So it's just to give credence and then follow up on the how best can we do the inward mobilization. And then why there are differences in terms of the kind of conflict that's taking place across different countries in Africa. There are some peculiarity in terms of the types, peculiarity in terms of have those different parties moved on. For instance, let me pick to the context of Nigeria, for instance. Why some could posit that Igbo people have moved on from the Biafra conflict, as Nigerian move on from the Nigerian conflict. And then that brings the debate of, okay, is it involvement in politics or the negotiation about power can be given? But when we tell the story of this conflict, who is telling what? Are they giving account on what suits their narrative? Do we have a common front as regards what happened? And then this transitional justice, without a real account of what happened, we will just continue to still hammer and then going in circle in terms of identifying the issues, developing a framework to addressing the conflict. So I think for like the longest time, we've just been moving in circle without, debunking the process itself to say these are the real issues, whether it is Lawal that tell the story or Unamdi from another place or Sule from elsewhere. We should have a common front in terms of the narrative, and that could help us in a way to address each of the conflicts, and then to then move into the reconciliation, the other component of the transitional justice component of it. So that's just the one piece I want to learn, like how do we drive it that our front in terms of narrative are even there are just little differences, but then it's not two people telling the same story and then it's 0 to 100, 0 to 100 from each of the divides. How is AU looking at implementing a common front in terms of story? What is the true story of everything that has happened in Burundi, in Rwanda, in Nigeria, in all of these locations? And that can help us to know how best to approach them and then look at issue of transitional justice beyond just the rhetorics. That's my contribution.
Thank you very much. Prof.
Thank you so much, Doc. Much appreciated. It's been a really engaging conversation so far. Really commend all the authors and their brilliant insights and suggestions of how we can actually take things forward. So there's a question from the chat you mentioned. It's from Nyeri. Nyeri is actually a very well-known sparring partner in terms of the TJ field. She's with the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in Joburg. And we have done some trainings together. So it's good to see her throwing grenades from behind the screen. On the point of reparations, I think it's a very important point, championing reparations, socioeconomic, cultural rights. I think the biggest challenge is that it's an issue that gets marginalized. It's an issue that is only given, you know, a second thought after the fact. And so in terms of how to trigger or engage, motivate actors to engage in this, and also mostly the political actors, in fact, I think we will definitely need to have a system that can allocate significant national resources, not only financial, but also personnel, to raising the awareness of the importance of socioeconomic cultural rights. And I think that is not being privileged sufficiently. So as Tikamaya said, you have to do the research, you have to do the knowledge investment to actually uncover what are the issues, how can we also explain them, or at least engage communities in a constructive manner. That means researching importance of redress, accountability, reparations, socio-economic, cultural reparations, rights and reparations, and the importance of these as vehicles to actually restore the human dignity and to heal the past of the people who've been brutally violated, those who have been subject to human rights violations, dispossession of land, gender-based violence, a whole gamut of atrocities. And then there's a two-point strategy. Once you've improved your understanding, you've got your research, you need to have a community outreach program so that people actually can engage and come on board and also mobilize. And I think Tikamaya likes to remind us that transitional justice should become a social movement. It's not sufficient for it to remain at this elite level of academic, discussion, policy engagement, training in specific institutes. It really needs to go down to the ground and become an organic movement of the people saying that we want redress because violations happened, they have to be addressed. And only once we have done that in mobilizing people, we have an optimal mass, we have a growing mass of people that can actually begin to trigger these conversations in different spaces. And particularly at the level of policy, where you get the most pushback, the greatest resistance to these issues. And the reason is our politicians, regrettably, they're allergic to dealing with the past, particularly if they themselves have had a hand in performing the atrocities or executing those atrocities. You had what Lawal said, there's just an avoidance of the truth. And then we're going around in circles, not really identifying the issues that need to be addressed. So Lawal is absolutely right. We need to have processes in all of our 55 countries across the continent that will surface all of the issues that affect societies, including colonialism, going even further back to slavery, and the tensions that may have existed between different ethnic groups way back in time, to the time of our ancient empires in Africa, because those still play out in certain ways, right? And unless we surface them, we don't know how they're feeding into the dynamic that is affecting our societies. And is absolutely correct on Biafra. If you don't surface the truth of what happened in Biafra and other conflicts in the region, I think you will always have this continuous underlying tension that it remains unexpressed, and then it eventually bursts out in a spontaneous burst of violence, and everybody says, what's going on, right? And I think this is precisely the problem in Sudan. Sudan has never had a process of dealing with the past. It has never addressed the historical injustices, the compounded violations of all the military regimes that have suppressed the people. And the 2018-19 was a very good opportunity for the revolution to lead the way. But that process was unfortunately hijacked by the military, who eventually started a war in 2023. So politicians are allergic, but we have to accompany them. We have to engage them, which means the knowledge we have generated, we have to use now to engage our policymakers and to encourage them to allocate the resources. So we have to curate and convene policy dialogues as well, where we engage them to say, actually, these resources need to be allocated to addressing social, economic, cultural rights, and reparations, and so on and so forth. I think that's the way to go, Nyari, just to respond to your question and also to link into Lawal's contribution. And this is not unique to Africa, by the way. The riots in Europe are blowing up because those countries have never dealt with the past. You have a fascist right wing that believes that it wants to try to return Europe back to what it was before. They had all the influx, which in some countries they invited the immigrants quite openly because they needed them after the Second World War to rebuild their countries, right? So you can't now all of a sudden turn around and say you're not welcome anymore. And I think that needs to be surfaced. And until people actually really engage with that past, they keep regurgitating the notion that they have to purify their countries. The United States, the same. January 6th was very much an uninformed, invasion of the U.S. Congress. So it's a common problem. It's not unique to us in Africa. The good news is we have some expertise in Africa, as you can listen to the speakers on this platform. The authors of these chapters, we have the expertise in Africa. There's no doubt about that. And we should even be advising our friends in the global north how to solve problems without, breaking out into violent protests. We have the expertise. Let me just put it that way. So I think this would be my few points in terms of how we can ensure we move to political action and engagement, not just simply talk, and we actually see things happening. Thanks, Doc. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah, I would also like to greet Ms. Pariola. I didn't know she was the one. It's nice to have her on our platform. So let's take the final question from Leye.
All right, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, I needed to confirm that because I've been in transit. I'm currently at the bus station, so I wasn't sure if you could hear my voice clearly because of the noise around. Yeah, I joined late, but I've been able to tap into quite a number of things that have been discussed around the question of transitional justice. And this is interesting for me because I'm currently working on a paper, that questions the process of transitioning and the aftermath, of transition. And my main concern is that countries transit but fail to instill the ingrains of democratic practices during the process of transitioning. That would have been the best time to plant the seed of democracy. So I'm using the concept of democratic impartiality to query that, because state actors in a number of cases actually become inheritors, of the entire process over and over again. We saw what Obasanjo did with the HRVIC in Nigeria. He was a beneficiary of abuse. I mean, a perpetrator of abuse. He became a beneficiary by being the president who actually inaugurated the HRVIC. And because the tenets of democracy had not been fully ingrained, that was why he could send the military into the OD village to wipe out the complete village, even in a democracy. The same with Mr. Buhari, who was one of those indicted by the HRVIC, but who never turned up, and then he became the president in Nigeria again twice, on two occasions. And I think this sort of thing is also finding its ground again in a country like Rwanda. I'm afraid that post-Kagame Rwanda may actually need another kind of reconciliation committee because commission, because of what it does. I mean, people try to confuse infrastructural development with democratic principles. Yes, you could find that in Rwanda, but what about the ingress of democracy? How free are the people? How do you treat your opponents? And these are part of the questions, that created the possibility of abuse in the first instance that made it important that transitional justice committee or commission would need to be set up. And we could find a repeat of these in countries because the ingrain of democracy, failed to be planted at a point of transitioning. So I think that's part of what I think African countries or any other country whatsoever, transitioning, from a state of violence, state abuse, and what have you. These are part of the things that need to be considered. And at the same time, the state should also be seen as an equal party in the entire dialogue, because what we do most of the time is we give the state certain kind of prerogative of existence in such a way that we do not see the state as being culpable. We only talk about state actors, but the state itself, because the state is also an agent, an active agent. State violence isn't just unleashed on the people by ordinary citizens. It's because of the protection that the state has. The Nigerian law protected, Obasanjo protected, Buhari protected, Babangida, and a host of others. And the states, have also not been brought to the table as an equal party in that, because if they are brought to the table as an equal party in that, then maybe we'll then begin to talk about how then do we really structure democracy? How should the state, be organized? So that's my take. I don't want to take too much of our time. Thank you so much.
Is this for me? Okay, yeah. I don't know whether I'm audible. Okay, yeah. I think I froze for a while. So, yeah, I think we just leave the platform open for all of our panelists to take turns to respond. Then we'll wrap up because we'll spend beyond the time that are allocated. So maybe we'll start from Zikamai this time. Just perhaps your last word on it, and also maybe respond to the contribution. I'm just trying to start from the back. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yes, yeah. I think as my last reflection is the acknowledgement that I think Prof. Murichi mentioned that we do have the talent here in Africa. And I come from Zimbabwe, where we are currently involved in many struggles for human rights. And human rights movements usually get accused of being Western driven. I think the African Union Transitional Justice Policy Framework gives us an opportunity to have this conversation from an African perspective within an African context, and appreciating that transitional justice is very African. I think it became prominent from South Africa's TRC, which worked throughout the Madiba Magic and emphasizing the role of political will, the role of national leadership, but also emphasizing that there is also need for political accountability, because politicians and leaders left to their own will, they don't want to do things that shift power from them. And violence is state power in many African countries. Hence, as citizens, we need to build movements that hold our leaders and create, while we are pushing for political will on the citizen side, through civil society organizing, youth movements, we need to build political accountability for transitional justice in Africa. Those would be my final reflections.
Thank you very much. Shinji, do we come to you so that...
Yes, sure. I think I had two questions around funding, even though my chapter is not around
you can.
financing. I think I just would quickly make the point around the specific question around what the chapter proposes with regards to mobilizing funds. I make the point in the chapter around mobilizing funds through the African Development Bank, the African Capacity Building Foundation, the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, and then through NEPAD. There's also within the confines of the AUTJP a requirement for the African Union Commission to establish an African Transitional Justice Fund. This is at the authorization of transitional justice process. The fund is supposed to have a clear budget, guidelines to ascertain and allocate appropriate funds for nations that need, or regions that need TJ assistance. I make a proposal as well that similarly the African Court for Human and People's Rights could consider an introduction of mandatory financial payments for the TJ fund from guilty parties in cases where financial compensation or reparations are ordered. This would be akin to what the ICC does with the Trust Fund for Victims at the end of a judicial process, using finances from guilty parties to give financial compensation to victims of crimes. And I think the last point that I make in this section around funding is that the AUTJP asserts that it's primarily the responsibility of individual states to implement their own transitional justice processes. So there still is a responsibility that is incumbent on the states themselves to make the resources available to initiate TJ processes. These are just not judicial processes, the rebuilding of institutions, capacitating of institutions, paying the relevant personnel, etc. And so I think the question around funding is multifaceted, but there are blueprints or plans that can be initiated around resource mobilization. I think like what Tsigamai had said, the question is also around including communities, and communities have much to contribute, which is not just about finances, creating a processes that are culturally specific, providing platforms for truth-telling, reconciliation, etc. That's also important. And so I think maybe the last point that I wanted to make is that I think that the AUTJP provides for us a important and essential framework that allows us to take ownership around the meaning of justice and what justice means within our own specific contexts. And I hope so that we don't get caught up only around questions of resource mobilization, but also around mobilizing our own communities, giving access to citizens to define what justice means to them, to define justice in ways that are culturally specific and relevant towards them, and to create frameworks and platforms for sustainable justice and peace programs. And so I think that's where I'll end.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you so much. I would like to just comment on an intervention on one of the participants who discussed or who mentioned the danger of what may happen after President Kagame, for example, leaves power in Rwanda, which brings us to the danger of a selective memorization, because that's how I can describe it. For those who follow the history of Rwanda, you know that in the beginning, when the issue of genocide was mentioned, they used to talk about the genocide against the Tutsi and moderate Hutus. But with the time, the moderate Hutus were removed and forgotten. So now it's just a genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and that's it, which is a reason why some of the Hutu community, there is a lot of frustrations and a lot of anger, because some of them were victims in a certain way, and they suffered because of the Patriotic Front, the Rwandese Patriotic Front, because it's not innocent It was not an innocent actor. Actually, there are people who today speak of a double genocide. On one side, which was committed by the Hutu in power, and on the other side, a genocide which was committed by the Rwandese Patriotic Front. So if these issues are not brought on the table and all these stories are allowed to have a space, indeed, as the participants said, there is a danger of the aftermath, because today, if we see a kind of peace, it's because the president of Rwanda is leading the country with an iron fist. So when he's gone, it's not quite clear how things will go. And this bring me to also agreeing with what Dr. Mtero said, that political will is a key element in this. Whenever we want transitional justice process to succeed. So if political will is in short supply, as she said, it's a danger. It's something which we need to insist on, whether we have an opportunity to do advocacy work or to discuss with political leadership. We need to insist on this issue, that the political leadership is open and is as inclusive as possible, so that we avoid problems in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Munini. Is I don't think I can see Munini here. Okay, Munini is still here. Munini, you have the platform. Yeah. You have to unmute. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Oh, thank you for unmuting. I appreciate it. There's one of our participants who talked about truth telling. And in truth telling, from an ecological perspective, I would like to invite us to look at the reports by the United Nations Development Programme. These are the post-conflict environmental impact assessments that are part of truth-telling processes. But I'm not sure how much or how often we refer to these reports when we're talking about the ecological damage or the environmental justice aspects within our work. And one of our colleagues just mentioned about knowledge building. And this is part of the knowledge building, accessing some of these materials so that they can help us in the work that we do, but more so creating this information as well, especially in a continent where we have a lot of natural resource-based conflicts. And we are now facing the energy transition that's coming with its own challenges. It's something that we will not afford to overlook. It will come up again and again when we have to talk about justice for our communities, but also ecological focused justice. And so my call would be for us who are implementing the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, it's time to enrich the framework, and it's also time to broaden the implementation of this framework so that we are not static, but we are contextualizing the framework within our regions and to speak to our own issues. Just like one of our colleagues also said that transitional justice having largely been borrowed from the West, probably not started, but borrowed a lot from the West with a heavy look into civil and political rights. But within our context, we are seeing a lot of social, economic, and cultural rights issues coming into this framework. And so it is time, as a continent that's highly rich with natural resources that are entangled with our lifestyles and livelihoods, it's time to bring this discussion into the table and not to let it fall off the cracks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prof, we'll just love to hear from you to help us wrap up so that we'll conclude.
Oh, absolutely. Well, much more to say for myself, just to really commend the authors who contributed to this book for their excellent work and for their dedication to generating knowledge in Africa. Dr. Mtero, Munini, Patrick, and Sekamai, really grateful for the hard work they put into this. And we are thanking you also, West African Center for Transitional Justice, for having the initial idea to convene this. You pushed us, so we came, and we're very pleased to be here. And to all the participants who participated in the discussion, I think we counted almost 28 at the peak, which is a very good turnout for this conversation. Really appreciate everybody taking the time from their busy schedules to be with us. And let's keep knowledge production going forward in Africa. Thank you, my brother. Doc.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. So thank you for the great work that you do on TG as well. We'll just use this concluding section to invite us for our next event.
I think, Philip, you froze it. Are you still there? So this is the next event. I think you have all the information there. In the absence of Philip coming back, maybe Philip, you can turn off your camera, Doc. But in the absence of that, then maybe I think we can just say a goodbye to everyone. And thank you for your participation in this very important discussion. And let's keep the lines of communication open, and let's keep the research collaboration going strong. So I hope some of you will be writing your own books. I'm looking at Dr. Montero and inviting some of us to contribute chapters to them going forward. So I thank you very much on behalf of the West African Center for Transitional Justice, on behalf of the Institute for Transitional Justice, and have a good evening going forward. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye.
Sorry for those who are left. Just to wrap up, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you at subsequent events. Sorry for the connection. And bye. Have okay. Have a